How the Yardbirds came about was there was a very close friend of mine called Topham, Anthony Topham, and we were in an art stream together down in Surrey. Sort of the art stream experiment, and then art school, you know, was kind of a burgeoning thing in the early 60s. And he introduced me through him, actually, and his father, we had an introduction into sort of some great blues records. His father somehow was able to bring back from America or whatever some great 75s of the electric Howling Wolf type blues stuff. So Top and I sort of formed our own thing, and we got Jim McCarty involved, who wasn't at the art college. So we had a drummer, a couple of guitar players, but we were kind of short of the ensemble we wanted. And we'd heard of Keith Relf. I think he was at Kingston Art College, and they had a band with a guy called Paul Samuel Smith, and Laurie Gaines was also in this band, but they called themselves the Metropolis Blues 5 or whatever it was, you know. And we kind of met, and we were playing electric, Top and I. That's the sort of music we were into, and they were playing more acoustic blues, but they obviously liked what we were doing, and they decided we would amalgamate their personnel with our personnel and become one band, which metamorphosized into the Yardbirds after sort of deciding that the name they had was pretty ghastly, I think, actually, to be honest with you. So Keith, we all sat down and thought of all sorts of names. One of them was the Roll-Ups, God knows what else. And the Yardbirds seemed right because we were already starting to do a bit of traveling and playing. And the Yardbird, the connotation we saw was like a hobo, American hobo, who hopped lifts on trains and, you know, and traveled the country. We felt it was a perfect name, you know. So that's how the Yardbirds became the Yardbirds. What we were trying to do with American blues music, there really were no venues to play it. I mean, the big thing in those days was the trad jazz scene, which was very popular, and that's the sort of venue that a pub venue or even the Marquee was slightly trad jazz or jazz orientated. So there was nowhere for us to play, and initially we literally went to a pub and said, can we play on a Thursday night? You know, and then it was all word of mouth, you know, a bit Arctic Monkeys, but without the web, you know. So it was a bit harder, but it kind of worked. We built up a following, and then nudged our way into playing intervals at some of the other clubs. The club owners, not being stupid, sensed there was a market for this. People like Harold Pendleton, who, you know, ran the Marquee, etc. They were entrepreneurs, although they loved all forms of music. But so they started to book us as the main act, and gradually this band that was sort of bumming around, we were playing 7 nights a week all around London. There was a lot of clubs springing up, like the Ricky Ticks, the Crawdaddy was another one. And then what happened? We were sort of professional, if you like. You know, we were earning £8 a week, and in those days, not bad. But Topham's parents, and I have to say that Top is a very gifted artist, very, very gifted artist, to this day, in fact. But his parents kind of didn't want him to go on become a musician, and they pulled parental rank. So we'd just been offered the gig to replace the Rolling Stones at the Crawdaddy Club. I mean, that was pretty mega for us. And Top got pulled, so we were without a lead player. So, you know, a bit of a frantic moment. But again, in the art school system and the same college that I went to, Eric Clapton, I think he was a couple of years ahead of me, but he, again, was another freak on the blues and you name it. And he was the one professional musician that we'd heard about at the time who was playing this sort of music. But I think he was playing with a band called Casey Jones and the Engineers with Tom McGuinness. another great blues player, actually. So we got hold of Eric, and we invited him down to our rehearsal room in Richmond, and said we've got these gigs, and we're about to replace the Stones at the Crawdaddy, and we jammed, because at that time the Yardbirds were playing much more blues music, very much more blues music. So he made the decision that, it probably wasn't a bit of a no-brainer really, because Casey Jones and the Engineers was a bit of a novelty act, so he decided to join us basically, and that's when it really started to take off. We were playing the clubs. Eric was obviously very gifted from the beginning, although I know he's a cyberspace star now in the whole world. But at the time, he was a young kid like us, and he was learning his chops and piecing his solos together painstakingly. And as we were playing 7 nights a week, and sometimes 3 times in a night, everybody was getting kind of oiled, and the Yardbirds were starting to build up a pretty big audience around the circumference of London and also in inner London. And Eric also picked up his own following. He was a good-looking guy. He had charisma. He had that sort of enigmatic thing about him, and he was he was a good player. Although, as I say, and I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying this because I think he's mentioned it himself, Eric is sort of, he's a journeyman in as much as, he will work painstakingly on every aspect of his playing, his posture, you name it, his look even. But playing with Eric and doing all those one-nighters, the Yardbirds started to, although we were playing a lot of 12-bar blues music, we started to extend solos and passages and started to do things like unusual time changes, which became a thing with the Yardbirds. Nobody else was doing it, really. I mean, we had this tremendous energy. I mean, Jesus, we were young. We were sort of in this unbelievably great occupation. We were part of that whole 60s scene of changing the culture. And young people were just as energized, the audience were just as energized as the band. So you got sort of things like, power breaks, early power breaks, and sort of crescendos and build-ups, and playing very fast, almost early punk in a way, It was just this tremendous energy everybody had. The thing about the Yardbirds, it was a great live band, just like, some other bands were, and certainly what Led Zeppelin became. These guys could play live. They could turn an audience on, totally, like all the great bands, but we could never get that sound, on record. It was pitiful, So doing a live album where you had the feedback from the audience and that atmosphere and the energy coming out, everything being played, probably actually, I think they may have speeded the tape up, I'm not sure, but pretty fast, proved a good move, definitely. Although Paul Samuel Smith leant on the red button at the back of the studio and wiped half of it. He said, "What does this button do?" Pressed it and wiped about, I don't know, quite a few tracks. But that was the 60s, We were playing all the clubs around London. The Rolling Stones had already made a fairly successful single called Come On, and in those days, to become national, to become nationwide, you had to go on sort of like theatre cinema tours, which were pretty awful, but that's all that was available. And to promote your record, you'd go and play for 20 minutes in the Gaumont, Huddersfield, or wherever it was, And I think like all artists, really, we wanted our work heard by more people, I guess. And I think also at that time we wanted to establish more of an identity for what the band was about. It was an interesting band because, you had Eric, who was a complete blues purist, you know, and he had his road kind of mapped out. But then you had Paul Samuel Smith, who was just, you know, a genius in his own right in terms of arrangements and original thinking in music. And then you had Jim McCarty, who's a very competent songwriter, a very sensitive Keith Relf, one of the very early great ad-lib exponents of the harmonica for a European. Great writer too. It was an eclectic bunch of people, and it was a bright bunch of people actually. And as I say, coming from art school backgrounds, you know, they weren't too narrow-minded. So after a couple of singles, we were playing, funnily enough, the Beatles invited the band to join them on their sort of yearly week in London at that time, at the Hammersmith Odeon. And they invited the Yardbirds to join them because we were very street cred and they liked our music, etc. But it was during that period that we were made aware on a demo of a song called For Your Love, which was kind of an interesting song for us because it had an eclectic sort of feel to it. It was a bit odd. It wasn't the blues, but it allowed us to do something in the break that was quite bluesy, the break in the song. And anyway, we felt we could do a good arrangement and do that. And I have to say, you know, on the day of recording, it was an electric moment. You don't get many, but that was a pretty electric moment. We knew that what we had there was something very special. Unfortunately, you know, Eric didn't really like that direction, fair enough. And he, I think, was also having slight personality problems with a couple of people involved with the band. And anyway, he played on the record, but he decided at that point that he didn't like the direction the band may go in. It wasn't pure enough for him at the time. So he opted out. We had this song, and you know, as I say, there was definitely a feeling that this is going to be something special, and it was. It just rocketed, you know. But we didn't have a guitar player, so we put the feelers out. Giorgio Gomelski and his sidekick Hamish Grimes, and who we knew. Well, we did know of Jimmy. I think he was at some art college, and he lived in Epsom, because a lot of the band came from that Kingston, Richmond, Epsom sort of enclave, you know. And I remember meeting him on Tolworth Broadway outside the pet shop, because actually Jimmy liked goldfish. He was into marine life, and he was buying something for his goldfish at the time, something to feed them, I don't know. Having this conversation with him about joining the band, and he said, well, you know, he declined pretty much because he had a lot of session work that he was playing with a guy called Big Jim Sullivan. They were the two guitar players who had the chops and was making a lot of music sound very exciting. And I guess it was very comfortable, you know, and it was good money. And he was learning a lot in the studios from engineers and producers, you name it. And I guess he figured at the time he didn't feel like he wanted to go out on the road and go in a transit van and eat horrible food on motorways and sleep in B&Bs and get shagged a lot. I don't know, but he didn't make the decision to join us then, but he recommended a young guitar player called Jeff Beck. And he said, you've got to check him out. He's playing with a band called the Tridents, and he's a bit special. So he was checked out. He was playing, I think, at the Eel Pie Island, small gig at the Eel Pie Island. And his band was good, the Tridents, but I'd not really heard of them. But of course, he was made an offer he couldn't refuse. Do you want to join a band that's got a #1 hit, you know, possibly worldwide? Well, and of course the Yardbirds had a reputation for being a bit of a guitar band by that time, and letting their guitar players stretch it, and also being free form. So it was a bit of a no-brainer for Jeff, I'm sure. And so from Jimmy's recommendation, the genius Jeff Beck joined us. At that point, when Jeff joined us, we were beginning to stretch our group talents for writing and experimenting. I wouldn't say at that point that we were in any way, well, psychedelia was not really sort of known about. You know, LSD wasn't quite on the market at the time, and the music for us at that time, I mean, For Your Love, I think it was actually written by Graham Gorban, who wrote our second hit, Heart Full of Soul. Very cool singles that still stand up today because they just had something, you know. And I think the band performed well on them too. So we were sort of kind of thinking, well, at that point, what can we do to keep ourselves in the charts, but also do what we wanted to do and use our own writing talents. So we were starting to write things like Shapes of Things, and also we were beginning to travel in America at that time. Some sort of groundbreaking, well, they called it the British invasion. Well, they can call it what they like, but we were sort of we're starting to tour America, you know, Coles to Newcastle, if you like. But of course, we weren't playing just blues music at that point. We were playing these much more eclectic poppy songs, but we were also playing sort of more underground stuff like Shapes of Things, which had philosophy in the lyrics, but also was very exciting musically. I wouldn't say they were psychedelic, particularly at that point. I do think that our more psychedelic period came when Jimmy was with us. But it was a sort of crossover period, definitely, musically. The Yardbirds, by about 3 or so years in, 3.5 years, that's Paul Samwell-Smith, myself, Jim McCarty, and Jeff Beck. We were playing like 400 nights a week. Oh no, that can't be quite right. 400, 500 shows a year. I mean, we would go and tour America and like come back with no money. I mean, I suppose the only thing you could say in retrospect is that we were spreading the message. But we were doing these crazy tours, which meant we played in some historic places, we met some fantastic people, some great audiences, but it was kind of making some of us a bit nutty. And one of the people who went a bit nutty more than most was Keith. And like the wonderful Sonny Boy Williamson, who we'd done an album with, who always carried a bottle of whiskey in his briefcase with him, Keith kind of started to get into that jag. And it caused friction with Paul Samwell-Smith, who I think, although, you know, I always consider him, he's so talented, Paul, but he was always a bit of a square peg in a round hole, although I'd say that for a lot of the Yardbirds, actually, funnily enough. But Keith was drinking a bit, and it was all getting a little bit, you know, but there was no Priory in those days. You couldn't check out, and some nice person would charge you £1,000 a week to give you a toe massage. You just did it. It was relentless, you know. And I remember we were booked, I think, for either the Oxford or the Cambridge College May Ball, which was a big event in the university calendar. And I believe on that night we were playing with the Hollies, or quite an interesting lineup. And they treat you very well. I mean, there's a lot of backstage courtesy, including alcohol, and and a lot of time. I mean, you know, anybody in rock and roll will tell you that it's 1% fabulous and 99% boredom at times. And poor old Keith was in the 99% part, and he got pretty pissed again. And we almost had to strap him to the microphone, and he forgot all the lyrics. And I mean, actually, it was a wonderful show. I mean, you know, punk eat your heart out. This was the real thing, you know. But Paul, I think he was kind of at his end of his tether with this sort of behaviour and sort of slightly unprofessional, blah-de-blah. But it just so happened that Jimmy had come up with Jeff in the audience. And of course, Jimmy loved he just thought it was amazing, you know, this completely irreverent sort of rock and roll scene going on. And I think Paul pretty much said on the night that I just can't do it anymore. This is just not for me, you know. And Jimmy put his hand up and said, I'll play with you, you know, I'll play bass with you. This is what I want to do. I want to get out there now, you know.